Okay, so welcome to another episode of Belong in HE. Really great to have you with us. For those who have messaged me, emailed me, thank you for your support. If you are finding value from these episodes, do let me know on LinkedIn. I'm Nathan Gunn on LinkedIn. Just send me a shout. Talking about LinkedIn, we are in the throes of setting up our community of practice on improving student outcomes. We're hoping that we can kind of launch our first online session coming shortly within the next kind of few months. It will be on governance structures regarding the APP. So access participation wonks, please do join. If you'd like to get involved in that, again, just put a request in through LinkedIn. We'll add you to the community of practice, the online group, or you just message me directly and we'll add you on. This episode, I'm really excited because I've got a long-time friend in the sector who's done some amazing work and will be talking to us all things inclusion, curriculum, and outcomes. So big hello to you, Aranee.
Hi, Nathan. It's so lovely to join you.
Awesome, awesome. So I'm just going to give our listeners a brief idea of your background. So Aranee is a Senior Associate Director for the Careers and Employability at King's College London, with experience across the areas of teaching, student experience, and educational development, as well as equity, equality, diversity, and inclusion. She specializes in taking a whole student lifecycle approach to improving student outcomes. An advanced HE Senior Fellow, she specializes in inclusive approaches to curriculum design and has significant experience working with academic and professional services teams to facilitate real-world learning using high-impact pedagogies and assessments delivered in collaboration with community and industry partners. A committed advocate for equity and inclusion, Aranee serves on a number of advisory groups, including the Institute for Student Employers, ISC, EDI Working Group, Royal Society of Biology Hubs Awarding Gap Network Advanced He's Race Equality Charter Governance Committee, and as a board director for AGCAS, where she leads the social mobility, widening participation, and regional inequality portfolio. Aranee is also the director of AM Coaching and Consulting, a consultancy specializing in establishing inclusive working, learning, and research cultures. So great to have you with us, Aranee. Really pleased that we've got nailed you down to an episode. Amazing.
Thanks for having me.
For many of the listeners, just to let you know, I first met Aranee 2017, quite a
Spring
while back.
2018, yeah, exactly.
Yes. And it was part of a diversifying leadership cohort. So really looking at diverse leaders and who's going to be the next up and coming leaders in the sector. Where we participated, it was insightful, really a great cohort to be part with. And yeah, just since then, we've always kept in contact, kept in touch, kept our fingers on the pulse of what's going on in the sector. And I think this leads me to my first question is, you've definitely got the bio and you're definitely, shining in all that you do. But tell us a bit about your journey. How did you get into higher education? How did you get into inclusion and all things, hey?
How I got into higher education was that I sort of fell into it. So before, if we think about what I actually wanted to do as a young person, moving from school into my own higher education studies, I really wanted to work in the space of international development. From a young age, I contributed to kind of human rights activity and especially around kind of supporting minority groups affecting kind of war and conflict. And I come from a diaspora that is war experience. So for me, that was really close to home. And I grew up hearing all of these stories that, people in my community had experienced. And so for me, that was really what I wanted to do. I studied anthropology, then human rights law at master's level. But for anyone who knows anything about international development, really very difficult to get into, especially if you come from a working class background. You basically have to pay to get experience abroad, and that just wasn't viable for me as an option. So I thought maybe academia might be my way into it. And so I began a part-time PhD because I had to work. I had to work alongside it. I couldn't do a full-time PhD. And therefore, that is how I ended up falling into higher education, is by starting my PhD. I started teaching at my university. And that was really my first role within the university environment as a part-time lecturer in international relations. And I really loved it. I loved teaching. It was in a post-92 university. And so I really went in. I remember my first teaching session so clearly. I went in like really buzzed, and I asked the question, this first year students, it was their introductory module. I was like, so why did you choose international relations? And half the group had a clear answer as to that, but the other half, didn't know why they chose international relations. They chose it by clearing. It was one of the areas that they could come into university. And so, they didn't actually, many of them didn't go to the lecture, but they turned up to the seminar that I was leading. And I was like, oh, I realized very quickly I had to change the way I approached this, right? Because my experience, my personal experience was that I studied a subject that I wanted to study. I didn't know huge amounts about anthropology, but I knew that I loved studying about the world and society and cultures, and that's why I chose that as an option. I always said to my mum, you can do the graduate law version. So
Yeah.
that's how, as a South Asian student, I was able to go ahead and do a random degree like anthropology, because I told everyone I would do the conversion and become a lawyer. But it wasn't for me. And so actually teaching this predominantly WP cohort, I realized that we had such a breadth of experience and understanding within that cohort. And so I really needed to change the way I approached the subject and how I taught the subject to, really actively engage with that diversity of students in the classroom. And that was really my first experience of understanding that, right? I was a WP student at university, low income background, ethnic minority background. I'm neurodiverse. And so for me, obviously, I fit loads of those categories, but you don't know that as a student. You
Right.
honestly have no idea as a student. Whereas when you then start becoming a staff member, and either as an academic or in professional services, that's when you realize there are all of these different things that we need to think about in this space. And no one prepared me for that in advance of my first class, right? And so that year, I really spent a lot of time developing resources for new lecturers so that they have an understanding of how they can support diverse classrooms in that kind of way. And it helped me really frame my understanding of how higher education should be delivered. So that experience was really pivotal for my then what ended up being now a career in higher education. So from there, I moved into professional services, into a student engagement team. And really my area of remit, I was a senior community engagement advisor. And so anything community came under my remit. So I worked with the local police. It was a university town. So, lots of our students lived in the environment, as well as commuting from quite all far-flung parts of London. And so worked with the local police and local government, so local council, around issues in the local community and how we can mitigate and improve those. And we did really great work in that space, but also worked to look at what are the challenges around student engagement within the university environment. So I did research with a couple thousand students across 2 years and worked with student teams as well. So I had about 50 student staff working on different projects with me around building community in the university amongst our commuter student population, as well as doing projects in the local community as well. And in addition to that, I also ran these projects with those student staff. So those three areas around research, actual projects, and then stakeholder engagement were the key elements of that. And what I really learned through those projects in particular was how students flourished in those situations and these extracurricular activities that we were running. I really saw students grow in their confidence, in their understanding of their roles as community members, so being a part of a wider community, how we all have a mantle of responsibility in society. We did really interesting projects around our voice and how we can make change happen. And many of the students that I came across and who engaged with it really felt like they didn't have a voice, that they didn't have the ability to make an impact in the world. But actually, through engaging with us, they really grew and flourished in that. And so I went to my dean of students and I said, let me do this, but in the curriculum. How can we do community engaged learning in the curriculum so that we can have a greater impact, right? Because the extracurricular space is always only going to capture a tiny percentage of the student population. So he allowed me to go ahead and do that on top of my other responsibilities. And I went out just knocking on doors to see which academic teams would be interested. And there was a little bit of interest. And so we worked with them around kind of doing community engaged learning with external partners like small local charities and working with them and doing kind of work with them, real world projects with them in the curriculum. And that really allowed me then to progress into this new role that was created with the restructure of the careers service at that time, which was curriculum enhancement manager. And really, it was a new role at that time back in 2018. It was directly after the leadership program that I ended up getting that role. That leadership program really gave me the confidence to go ahead and apply for that role, actually. But what happened then, that the remit of that role was that we needed to improve graduate outcomes at scale across the university. How can we do this through the curriculum? And so taking the learning that I had from, doing that work around community engaged learning in the curriculum, I was then able to kind of build upon that in a more structured way. And it's what helped me really understand the perspective of academic teams, of academic colleagues in higher education, the very difficult job that they have actually, and how we as professional services teams can effectively support them to design inclusive curricula that really prepares students with that knowledge, skills, and experiences that they need to be able to then navigate this very, what we can understand as a VUCA environment, right? A volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment that all of our graduates are moving into. So they at least have the tools to effectively navigate that and kind of thrive in that space. So that's a short story of how I came to kind of the world of careers. And it is certainly an interesting world. And now I've kind of progressed into heading up a large careers department in a very different kind of university, in a research intensive university that comes with all sorts of different opportunities and challenges. And I still do a lot of work in this space around inclusive curriculum design. And it's very much how I framed it when I was doing that work, which is improving graduate outcomes is just an extension of our need to kind of design and deliver inclusive curricula. These are not agendas, these are exactly the same agenda. So the university I was at previously was a real pioneer in the space of inclusive curriculum design, but it was to the point of attainment. It was around addressing the awarding gap, why that work was initiated. Actually, there were outcomes gaps as well. And so really all I did was sort of build upon that really great foundation to then help academic teams think about what pedagogies and assessments can we use that kind of cultivates and develops their employability capability as well, and helps them recognize potential futures from these that they're doing.
That's amazing. And I think there's so much there to unpack, because even just from the question of why are you here, right, to the students, and then there's that snapshot of recognizing your own difference. Then we layer that with family expectations and how you navigated that. We already see how much different variables each student is having to navigate or think about in their experience, right? And so I can see why you've taken so much of a holistic approach, as well as thinking deeply about the external environment, right, of where that student has to navigate. You spoke about students to find their own voice as well. So, and imagine that you come into an institution, you come into a program, let's say you asked, why are you here? And for the first time, you've had to think about that. Then you arrive at your answer through reflection, but then you have to voice that and communicate that, and then maybe kind of position yourself to say, this is what I want from this experience. So there's a lot there, and hopefully we're going to unpack all of it. I think where I want to go is, all the time that I've known you, you've been extremely tenacious, extremely driven, but also you seem to balance that with just kindness, just being able to think about the human. I think you've developed, and probably, I don't know how much you'd agree with this, but you've developed a very secure, inclusive lens, right? So I think you see the world through inclusion and how things can be equitable. I'm thinking now, well, potentially be academics that can't see that, in such a clear way, and who are now maybe just coming to grips with some of these concepts and thinking about how they can start to think about it. What do you think is missing from the conversation around inclusion, or how to approach inclusion in the classroom, or, in engagement?
Yeah, I do have a really clear way in how I understand it. And I always say you can think about inclusion in two different ways. And the first is by the individual and thinking about what the individual requires to be able to kind of flourish or thrive in the environment. And then you can think about it from a structural perspective, which is what can we do in the things that we facilitate and deliver that removes barriers to engagement for anybody to be able to access, engage with, benefit from, contribute to whatever it is that we're trying to do. And I think both are really important and valid, but my focus is much more on the structural side of things. And it's why I talk about curriculum design. The curriculum is the most inclusive structure within the university environment because it's the one structure that all students must engage with in some way, right? We know that students today have huge amounts of priorities that they're juggling.
Yeah.
Many of them have financial and caring responsibilities that they have to actually prioritize above their studies. And when I speak like that with academics, some of them are shocked. I say, their degree isn't their number one priority. It's actually maybe their third or their fourth priority in the things that they're juggling. And therefore, that's why they are kind of strategic in how they utilize their time and energy because it's limited. So they engage with the compulsory aspects of their degree program. And it's why when I think about inclusive practice within the university environment, we should absolutely think about the whole student experience from kind of admissions all the way through to post-graduation, but also really have this focus on the curriculum being this really robust, intentionally designed environment that all students feel able to effectively kind of experience and navigate and benefit from. Because I think it's the one part of the university that we know the majority of students are actually going to engage with. And I think, as I said earlier, academic colleagues have a really difficult job, which is they're being asked to do world-class research, they're being asked to do world-class education, and they're being asked to do a whole range of administrative responsibilities around that, and to be good citizens in the university environment by, offering their time to different groups and activities and projects. And on top of that, they're also being asked to create curricula that is research informed, but also to embed things like employability and sustainability, to embed inclusion. I've got to say, I don't like that concept at all. It should be inclusive. You're not embedding inclusion into it. But also things like mental health and well-being and how we kind of help to support the development of really resilient kind of graduates as well. So that's huge, right? And it feels like it's a million different things that we're asking them to do. And really, my approach in working with academics is just trying to connect all the dots for them so that they can recognize that this change that we're trying to work on together is not affecting this one thing, graduate outcomes. We're actually looking at attainment. We're looking at continuation. We're looking at student engagement in the classroom. We're looking at, how through that same learning activity, we can support the cultivation of their understanding of sustainability and cultivate a little bit more of their resilience to kind of challenging situations. So for me, especially in the space of like employability, I know it's become this. Academics really don't like it because they see it as being a part of this value for money agenda, which really takes away from the concept of higher education and learning as being valuable in and of itself. And therefore, it has this kind of capitalist, neoliberal connotation that actually a degree should lead to a job. Many academic colleagues don't like that thinking, and I can agree with that. I also don't think that that's the most effective way to think about it. But I also, in this environment where students carry such a huge financial burden by taking on a higher education, I think we can all agree that it's really important we do support them to be able to think about their lives after. And so when I speak with academic colleagues about it, think about employability as like preparing them for a lifelong success. So what is the world that you are preparing your graduates for? What do they need to be able to do in this world? And then what would you like them to be able to do? And I think framing employability away from that employment context, but really around preparing them with lifelong kind of skills and capabilities is far more palatable for them. And connecting those dots allows them to recognize that the simple changes that they make, or indeed those holistic changes that they make, can meet multiple priorities that they're being asked to address. So it makes their jobs a little bit easier, actually. And the piece around inclusion is that I think we are in a habit actually in higher education of talking about inclusion and, EDI from the perspective of individual characteristics, when every single one of us is multiple things. So we're multiple characteristics that coalesce and kind of materialize in different kinds of ways. Therefore, none of us are going to be experts in everything, and none of us are going to be able to handle every variation of those intersections. But what we can do is try and remove barriers. So I talk about being inclusive by design, which is how we can look at something like a curriculum together and think about how we exposing students in that first year to all of the things they need to know in that first year, right? How are we introducing it to them? How are we building upon those initial foundational capabilities? And how are we helping them consolidate that in their final year so that they can leave with everything that they need? And I think when you look at it from a structural perspective, it is more challenging because more thought needs to go into it, right? You need to look at the big picture and you need to look at things collaboratively and together. But at the same time, it takes away some of the challenge, which is thinking about all of these different characteristics and the millions of intersections of those characteristics and how you address every single one of those, which can be paralyzing, I think. It can be really paralyzing for many colleagues, not just our academic colleagues. And so to think about it from this perspective, I've found to be effective and useful. And it helps them recognize that this is not about advantaging certain groups over others, which can sometimes be like how they receive the message when we talk about inclusion. This is about creating an environment where everyone has equity of access to be able to then go ahead and do the best they possibly can in that area. And it will improve key metrics that they are being asked to improve as well. So yeah, connecting the dots for people in an environment where we talk about things so distinctly and separate, I think is really important, especially for people who are time poor and hugely burdened with a very difficult kind of workload.
It's so interesting because just as you were speaking, I was thinking that higher education in and of itself, before the widening participation agenda, was actually very exclusive, right?
Absolutely.
In essence and historically. And so we're almost having to, and I like the way you think about the structural piece, because what we're talking about is actually not an individual per se changing by themselves, but actually the structures and environments that they exist in changing or adapting to something that's very different. Whereas before it was very much, we have to be exclusive, we're very selective, only a few will make it to the top. We're now saying, how do we broaden out opportunity so that more people can access and engage in and participate in and thrive in? And so that, I can imagine, will take a very different skill set, because it invites things like difference and multiple ways of doing things, accessibility, all these things. And so you spoke to the way you perceive it is inclusion is actually a single thread, but people can get lost in a myriad of threads. What about disability? What about neurodiversity? What about this? What about that? Where I guess it's the core principles that should enable all different types of characteristics to thrive in a curricular environment. So my question then is, what do you think are some of the hallmark features of an inclusive curriculum? Like, if somebody said to you, we have an inclusive curriculum, what would you be looking for? Some core key elements that you would be saying, this is what I would expect to see.
So one of the things I'd expect is that the course team have come together to work on that program together. And I think very rarely do course teams have that opportunity. In UK higher education, at least, we see programs being developed where module leaders develop their modules very separately from one another. So no one really knows what one another is doing in the program environment. Maybe the program leader does to a certain extent, but really no one's working together to design that together. And I think if you do want it to be truly inclusive, you would actually work together, at least at some points, to bring that program together to really understand who's doing what across the program, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't know, then there could be duplication in that program and there can be huge gaps in the program, both in disciplinary teaching and learning, but also in those other things around skills development and around the content and the pedagogies and the assessments that we're using. If we think about principles of inclusive curriculum, then I think some key things are that you would have a diversity of assessments. So you wouldn't have a program where 80% of assessments are essay-based, for example, or lab-based or exam-based, because the assessments themselves also not only assess knowledge and understanding, but also assess through the process of the assessment, you can develop skills and capabilities. So I think having a diversity of assessments across the degree program is really, really important. And another thing is that it's designed recognizing the diverse classroom, the student cohorts that they will have. So of course, looking at things like the content, the case studies, what is it that they're being introduced to through their discipline across the program as well. So assessment is a key one for me. I have a big focus on that. And I would also say, a diversity of the pedagogies used. So I talk about high impact pedagogies being those that are especially aligned to inquiry-based learning. So I'm a big proponent of problem-based learning, where, actually students focus on the problem and they think about, what do I need to know to answer this problem? And so it's rather than teaching them very specific things and them having to apply it, you're actually giving them the problem first so that they can then cultivate the skills and capabilities to understand what they need to know and be able to address that problem. And I think you don't need to do that in every single module of every year of study, right? But if you work together, you can say exactly the moments across the degree program where that really works and supports their kind of development, both from a disciplinary perspective, their subject perspective, but also in relation to their kind of skills and capabilities as well. And I think that kind of inquiry-based learning approach also supports the development of confidence, of resilience, because there's no spoon feeding in that environment. Students have to take charge of their learning in a problem-based learning environment. As long as there's the right scaffolding in place to give them the support, they have to go off and take charge of their learning in that situation. So from that perspective as well, we can think about how mental health and well-being, those skills in that space we want to cultivate, can be developed, and you can give them a challenge that is to do with the SDGs in relation to the subject area. And so they're cultivating their understanding of social sustainability as well. You can bring these agendas together through some types of high impact pedagogies and assessments, which makes it easier for the academic as well. So yeah, there are more things there, I guess, you can think about. But for me, that diversity of pedagogies and assessments is usually a key one. And then, of course, thinking about that diversity exposure to different types of content. So the diversified curriculum from that perspective.
I think that's huge, because especially the piece around the program team, or all the teaching staff on the team, being able to look from level 4 to level 6 and say, this is what we expect the student to learn at each level, the scaffolding that's going to take place, and even just the dialogue and conversations, right? Because then you get to really unearth expectations of different levels, different tutors. And I think, in my view, if that one thing was done, that would be like 50% of the work. Just getting the right people around the same table, right?
Yeah, totally. And it's such a shame. I feel like that's why academic colleagues are sort of left by themselves to get on with it. And they're not really supported to do kind of team working in that kind of way, or team teaching even. You can have synoptic assessments in that situation. If you bring your program team together, they might have a brainwave and be like, well, you know what? We can have a synoptic assessment that assesses both areas of learning, across modules. And that's exactly the reality in real life, which is we don't go away and learn one specific thing for one specific issue. We have to take the collection of our learning and apply it to numerous different situations that we come across. And so we've tried to recreate some of that in the program itself through, but actually it's the university structures that don't allow for them to come in that way to work together. But I was really lucky in my previous institution. I was able to facilitate some of that, and I saw how it worked in that room. I would have a course team come in and they'd be grumbling. It's like an afternoon, they're here for another 2 hour workshop with me. They've just had a 3 hour meeting this morning as a department, and they're really just tired and grumpy. And then, in those 2 hours, they're like, oh my gosh, like we can actually do this together. They're energized. They see what it looks like in front of them, their program, and they can see that actually the things that the university is asking them to do, that they're senior leaders in their faculties are asking them to do, are not such a challenge, because actually they can be achieved by just them coming together and thinking about it collectively. Because then those multiple problems don't become an issue for an individual, they become something that the team together look to address, right? Whereas I think because it's cultivated in this way where, yes, there's this concept of academic autonomy, so academic students who can and should be allowed to design their curricula in the way they want to, but when they are all by themselves, they really feel as though they have to do everything, and that's just not the reality. There's so much support for them if we're able to just facilitate this opportunity for them to come together.
Which again speaks to that structural shift, and that's something much more foundational that might need to change. But on the other side, I'm thinking about this inquiry-based learning, which is quite a shift pedagogically towards, again, yes, making the student the autonomous learner, they're at the driving seat. There's a link to the kind of elements that we see in authentic assessment, real world scenarios. So, for those who are listening who haven't heard about authentic assessment, it's where a student is given an assessment, but in a case study scenario type context, something that they might have to actually engage with in, let's say, their professional career or postgraduate kind of scenario. And it's been found actually with authentic assessments, it reduces disparities between groups and so forth. So, with this inquiry based learning, where do you feel it fits best? And this is just off your feeling or viewpoint. Is it earlier on in the degree? Is it later on? Should there be reflection on the back of it? How do you see it best working?
Yeah. It should be from the very beginning, Nathan. It should be from the very beginning. And you should do it with external partners from the very beginning. When I suggested this to academic teams, level 4, let's bring in an external partner for them to bring a real challenge that they're dealing with right now. And let's get our students in this program, in this module, working on that challenge in groups, right? Oh my gosh. There was just like, they're not ready for this. We don't want to put our students in front of an external partner right now. Students hate group work. So, what if they don't work well together? All of these things, right? And I said to them, the fact is that secondary education in this country, if we take students who maybe students who've come straight from the school environment, is not taught in an inquiry-based, problem-based learning manner, right? There is very much rote learning still in our secondary schools, unfortunately. We have really innovative teaching practice in primary schools, completely lost in the secondary environment where exams take control of things, so it's rote learning environment. So they're coming to us thinking that they can just memorize and regurgitate, and that will get them through a university degree. And we know that that's not the case, right? So taking a more applied learning approach where students have to be more active in the learning process is really important, because that's the reality in the world as well. That is how we have to navigate, whether it's our careers or our lives after university as independent people in the world. So the issue with putting it not at level 4, but like in the final year, is that if you continue with the rote learning sort of style, for
Mm,
example, of like essays and exams and things like that, what happens is that they're completely blindsided at level
mm,
6 with this new way of learning. And we know that that's a really important year. In most universities, it is a majority part of their final grade, right? So actually, level 4 is a safe environment for them to do this different kind of learning that is going to serve them better in the long term, because it's usually a pass or fail year. So you can have a really kind of lovely scaffolded approach to problem-based learning. You can absolutely get them with external partners working on a real world situation. It's great for then things like their CVs, because we know that internships and placements are not accessible to students from underrepresented groups because of the various priorities they have other than university. And so really there are numerous benefits to this situation. So my kind of big issue with higher education is that we have disciplinary learning. The fact that you have like maths, English literature, chemistry, then you
mhm,
have geography, and then, sociology and, graphic design. Like you have these very like different subject areas, some of which are extremely kind of narrow. And
mhm.
the thing is, what those students as graduates are going to go into is maybe not directly to do with that field. So I'm very much a proponent of also interdisciplinary learning. So that means that this problem-based learning approach, yes, it will test them on their disciplinary understanding, but also help them cultivate a little bit more of that interdisciplinary perspective, because they may realize if they have a challenge with a local charity or a local community organization, that there is some direct relevance to their discipline that they can apply, but they'll need to cultivate some extra skills to be able to support them in this as well. And I
Mm,
think that's the kind of direction higher education should be moving into, because when we go out into quote unquote the real world, we need to be able to take the full plethora of learning that we've had over the years and think about which elements fit where and how can we apply them into different situations. And so I think that problem-based learning approach is just more useful from that perspective. Completely lost track of what you asked me initially.
No,
I hope I've answered the question
it's
there.
absolutely fascinating because for me, in my masters, they didn't call it that then, but in my masters, I did business analytics, and one of our modules we had to do data crunching and stuff like that, and produce a solution to a problem that we had no idea what the answer was, but we had to do that work, right? And I remember it distinctly because I'm okay to go out there and try to figure something out, right? But I did notice that other people in my course who had just gone up maybe a purely academic or research route really struggled. And I think there is another piece to what you're saying around problem-based teaching, right? Like, how do we equip the students to
Absolutely.
figure this out? So for me, most of my learning on that, we had to literally pitch to some NHS executives on something real world that was happening there and then. It felt very Dragon's Den like, or Apprentice. But what I learned was building rapport, obviously understanding the language of the terminology, communicating the numbers into a narrative. Like all of that learning was taking place. And that's all the stuff I needed, I guess, for the real world. I guess the challenge was for some others, it was what's the right answer?
But there's sometimes this isn't right. Like in situations we're in, once we leave education, there's not one right answer. There are numerous right answers, and you have
Exactly.
to make a decision based on the information in front of you. And I think you're right. It's a different way of knowledge and understanding, but it does prepare you much better, I think. And it is
Yeah.
a much more equitable approach that allows for diverse learners. And by that, I mean diversity in multiple, not just demographically, but also with different educational backgrounds to be able to succeed in the
Yeah.
higher education space. So
Yeah.
there's lots of research underpinning and supporting that as well. In the same way as you said around authentic assessments, around problem-based learning, there is that as well. So I think it does move program teams and university education away from being theoretical into being far more applied. And that can be a little bit of a challenge in environments that they see themselves as being very research intensive focused. And so for them, that's a bigger jump, for example, compared to more teaching based universities that are more aligned with that kind of applied learning space. But there are numerous benefits for students. And indeed, for academics, they are being told there are these targets that they have to meet to improve metrics in numerous areas, then actually this will help them on that journey as well.
I'm really in agreement with you, and I think the bigger question I'm trying to ask myself is how the shift will actually happen. Because the reality is, with AI and the rest of it, you're right, rote learning will disappear. Just calling upon information. Yes, of course, we need in the professions, we need people knowing what they're doing, doctors, lawyers, so forth. But so rapidly, it will become human and AI working together to doing a lot of the rote information based stuff, and then what's left is the team working, social skills, problem solving, negotiating skills that come to the fore. We need to really get a hold of a pedagogy that speaks to that speaks to graduates being ready, because I think even on the AI front, I think GPT just launched an AI version that was PhD level, right? I think it was in maths or something. So it's going to be all the other skill sets. But bringing it back, what do you think? And I'm asking this question in the context of what we've already highlighted, that there's going to be people listening that are thinking just about their module because that's how the structures have made it, and maybe not the wider program. But what do you think staff could think about differently when it comes to equity? Equity and outcomes, things
Yeah.
that they can kind of crack on with themselves.
I think it's getting to know their cohorts. So I think a lot of people, which is a very human trait, by the way, is that they reflect on their own experience and think it's probably the same for others because that's all we know. That's our frame of reference. And I think the best educators are really the ones who take time to understand their students and then tailor their teaching and learning facilitation to them, basically. So if we're thinking about the simplest thing that an educator can do, it's really to teach to the students they have rather than the students they think they should have, who may be in their own guise, right? So
Mm,
I think that's the very simplest thing that people can initially do as part of that. And especially as a newbie lecturer, I think what we forget to understand is that many academics go into academia not necessarily because they have a huge passion for teaching, they have a huge passion for their research. An element of that then translates into their teaching. And then when you're bombarded with a range of things you have to do, to meet kind of external validation, it can feel like a much more onerous process and task. But I think the reality is if you try to understand the students that are coming into your programs a little bit more in the
mm,
beginning, then able to pivot or to align your teaching styles and methods with what will resonate most with them, then you're not going to have the challenges around student engagement in the classroom, for
mm,
example, which is one of the big things that many academics say is a challenge. Like they just don't come, they just don't engage. I work so
mm,
hard. And I totally feel for them because you can have super engaged academics doing everything and still having that situation occur. So
mm.
yeah, I think the best educators have a really good understanding of the student cohorts coming into their classrooms, what may be the challenges to engagement for them, and therefore amending what they're going to be doing in a way that resonates a little bit more.
Taking it away from the educators for a moment, and let's think further again, touching more into the future. Putting on your hat, thinking careers, graduate outcomes in that sense. With the dawn of AI and everything else, what do you think, or what do you sense the future may look like in terms of the future ready graduate? I don't know if
Yeah,
that's
the future
yeah.
is The concept of the future ready graduate, I think the crux of it is not about technical capabilities. And I say this often when I do workshops with academic teams, and I've been doing a few of them across different types of universities as well. And I always say it's not to do with their technical capabilities in your subject area, which will probably become redundant in a couple of years, right? Because technology is evolving so quickly. It's around their ability to continuously develop themselves. So they have to have an element of self-awareness to understand where they are now, to recognize where they need to be and how they're going to get to that position. So this concept of kind of continuous development. They need to then therefore be reflective in that process and have to be able to have that self-awareness. They need to be creative and have a problem-solving mindset, because really that is something that AI is not, AI is good at bringing forth the information and packaging it and compiling it and things. But creativity is always going to be the thing that sets the human apart from that situation. So when it comes to looking at problems in the world, that creativity is really, really important. And also their ability to communicate. So if we think about it, you can be the most intelligent person, but if you're not able to communicate and get your message across to others in the way that's intended, then that can really be curtailing to your effectiveness. So I think cultivating these very human capabilities and skills, communication and creativity, around supporting them to be self-reflective and have self-awareness, but then also kind of being able to look at the world with quite that, we talk about critical thinking a lot in universities, but I think very few areas really help students understand how you critically view things in the world, how you look at information and critically look at it to understand whether it's true or false or what you should be gaining from it. We don't do that explicitly, but that's also so important in an environment where, now the concept of deep fake videos, for example, where things we thought were reliable sources of information may no longer be reliable. The concept of thinking becomes that much more important. So these are hugely transferable capabilities. I think that they're very human capabilities. And I think that they're really required in an environment that is VUCA, that is challenging in multiple different kinds of ways. So yes, that's how we can think about the future ready graduates, because if they have those capabilities, then they can literally face any sort of situation and be able to navigate that effectively and successfully, and to be able to be continuously relevant in different environments, right? Because they are developing themselves in different kinds of ways. So their relevance continues, and it allows them to be much more, to have greater self-efficacy in that.
So my last question actually is, so I know you was part of a QAA funded initiative, and that was around supporting educators to inclusively develop their kind of employability through the curriculum. And I think you're working on something at the moment focused more towards employers to think about how they can inclusively hire and recruit. What do you feel are some of the things that we need to think about outside of the university walls in terms of employers now trying to find the right graduates? What are some considerations maybe that the employers need to be having when they're recruiting, I hope that makes sense.
So I think actually for the past few years now, larger organizations have been looking at how they can be more inclusive in their recruitment processes. And I think we know from the experience of universities and the widening participation agenda, it's not just access, right? It's not just getting those graduates into their organizations. Now it's really around how they then support them whilst they're there to progress and develop and continue contributing to those organizations. There is a high attrition rate in graduate level roles in larger organizations, and especially amongst those who are from underrepresented groups. So that issue that we see in universities around widening participation, we see. So for those bigger organizations, I would say it's moving from the concept of inclusive attraction and recruitment to inclusive graduate journeys, and thinking about it holistically. Perhaps that's just my shtick, which is thinking about things holistically. But I do think that's something that they need to consider. I think this project that I'm embarking upon now with colleagues in the AGCAS Social Mobility, Widening Participation and Regional Equality Working Group is that actually, how do we support SMEs? So the majority of our graduates from universities will go into a small or medium-sized organization, basically. And these organizations often do not have large early career talent teams, graduate recruitment teams. They've got one person who's doing the recruitment, and it might even just be on the manager themselves who's doing the day-to-day work. So they don't have the resources to be directing towards, is this inclusive, is this not? They don't have that knowledge or understanding or expertise or the time even to put towards it. So this project is really around working with the different universities across the country within their local regions to work with SME partners to think about how we develop with SME partners and then test tools to support inclusive recruitment, attraction, recruitment, and development that can form a toolkit that we can then promote to SME networks across the country, basically. And that's the goal of that. But what do they need to be thinking about? Well, it's just recognizing that, the graduates that universities are producing are hugely diverse, and therefore recognizing in exactly the same way I spoke about academics, actually, that their personal experience doesn't apply to everybody. And therefore, when we recruit, we shouldn't be thinking about it from, well, this is what I did to get recruited, so maybe that's what I continue doing, in this environment. What they really need to be thinking about is, what is it they need their roles to be doing for the organization? So what are the skill sets that they need coming into their organization? And what is then the recruitment process that will best help them identify those skill sets, right? So arbitrary things on job descriptions are never useful. So arbitrary qualifications, for example, arbitrary levels of experience. We don't do it a lot in the UK, the concept of you must have 7 years of experience. But you do see it a lot in kind of like the North American context and in other regions of the world as well. But that's meaningless. It doesn't matter if you've been in a role or, in an industry for that set of time. It doesn't mean that you're suddenly the best person to do that role compared to someone who's been in that sector for less amount of time, right? So I think it's really around looking at things like that, and really in the same way you would design an assessment in a curriculum suited to the learning outcome, you would also look at the recruitment process suited to the skills you want entering your organization. And I think there's a piece around this, which is also recognizing that once they're there, they should feel comfortable in that environment as well. So many sectors are used to having a homogenous type of person entering, and therefore they have these things that they do that can feel uncomfortable for different groups who maybe are outside of that norm in that environment. And it is important that those organizations understand that moving forward. I give an example around drinking culture. So even in higher education, you go to a conference, there's always going to be a drinks reception. And I remember going to a conference once, and there was no non-alcoholic alternative. I don't drink alcohol for no reason other than I don't want to. People are like, oh, religious things. Like, no, not a religious thing. I just don't want to. They literally went to some random office at the university and got out an old Asda orange juice for me to have, because nobody on that organizing committee recognized that there may be someone could be pregnant, they could have a health condition, there could be many reasons why a person chooses not to drink alcohol, but it did not occur to anyone on the organizing committee that they need to think like that. And I think sometimes it's just in smaller organizations, but just for recruiters or managers to understand that not everyone's going to be exactly the same as them. And so creating a culture and environment where people feel able and to contribute. I got to say that is the next bit that most organizations have to address.
Right.
It's the same with us in universities. We haven't got that right. It's why we still have awarding gaps. It's why we still have issues around continuation and withdrawals. It's why we still have outcomes gaps and things. But that is the bit that's also really important, not just getting them in as well. So this toolkit, hopefully, it's a multi-year project. Don't plan on producing anything too quickly, but the idea is that we work with SMEs themselves to develop and test those so that we can find things that are relatively easy to implement, but are really useful and impactful so that they can reduce attrition in that kind of way, that they can hold on to those graduates, but that they can also kind of really leverage the diversity of graduates within their regions and retain them in those local regions to support local economies as well.
It's such a huge area, and I think you're right. It's something that gets missing in this conversation about graduate outcomes, especially when you're starting to think about across the UK in different regional settings. And I remember one of my good friends told me about the concept of cultural fit versus cultural add. And, too often cultural fit can become a metaphor of just being like us, whereas cultural add is what else does this person bring, to the team, to the environment, and the rest of it. So, yeah, I do think we've got a way to go. But yes, no, it's heartening to hear that you're already started and embarking on this work.
I love the concept of cultural add and adding to that mosaic that makes up the picture of that organization, making that mosaic more beautiful, and to kind of really showcase more clearly what it's trying to reveal.
Exactly. And it's interesting because I came across some research that said, and this was quite large scale research that showed that most new employees or graduate kind of employees coming in, they want to know that the organization has thought about, at least on some level, equity, equality, diversity, and inclusion at some baseline level. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think that's going to become a bit of a USP as time goes on, especially for talent, across the board, want to see that equity piece in their career. But yeah.
Especially amongst the new generations that are coming into the workforce, I think that is a much greater priority for them in a wonderful kind of way, along with kind of healthy work-life balance and
Yes.
more values-driven organizations.
Hugely. Aranee, I want to say thank you so much. It's been an amazing time just getting to speak with you, go through a lot of this. We covered a lot from pedagogy to careers. How, if somebody listens to this, they want to get in contact, what's the best way for them to contact you? Is it social media? What's best?
Yeah, so you started off talking about LinkedIn, and absolutely, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm Aranee M on LinkedIn. People can always send me a message to speak about more. I do a lot of work with different kinds of universities in the space of how we can improve inclusive education, looking at research culture as well. Those kind of candidates entering postgraduate research and also staying and completing graduate research so that we can kind of diversify the academic space and environment as well, in addition to just kind of looking at staff life cycles, your student life cycles, and inclusive strategies as well. So always welcome to have a chat with anyone interested in those areas. LinkedIn, Aranee M, that's the best way to get in touch with me.
Awesome. Great stuff. Thank you so much, Aranee. And everyone, thank you for listening. I'll see you next time on the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you.